Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the last speaker meeting of this academic year. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, let me ask the Secretary to read the minutes of the last meeting.
Thank you, Nicholas. So the sixth meeting of the 133rd season took place at the Society of Antiquaries, Burlington House, Piccadilly, London, and online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 21st of April, 2026. Dr. Nicholas Bell, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, Dr. Bell introduced Dr. Matthew Payne, Treasurer and Vice President, who delivered the Graham Pollard Memorial Lecture entitled Who Was Elizabeth North? John Le Tout and London's First Printing Press. There were 111 attendees, 33 in person and 78 online. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part: Lisa Barber, Professor Eric Nye, Dr. Jacqueline Reed-Walsh, Dr. David Rundle, Janet Freeman, Meg Ford, and Dr. John Goldfinch. Dr. Bell thanked Dr. Payne warmly for his paper.
Thank you. Are you happy for me to sign these minutes? Thank you. Well, this evening it's my great pleasure to introduce the Homi and Firoze Randiria lecture for 2026. This lecture was endowed several years ago in memory of Homi and Firoze Randiria, and the subject has to be some aspect of book bindings. Many of you will know the book that was printed of Eloquent Witnesses, which compiled the first dozen or so of these lectures. We're probably almost due for a sequel to that. And today it's a great pleasure to welcome Andrew Honey to address us. Andrew is a book conservator at the Bodleian Library, where he's been working since 1998. He trained at Camberwell College and then at West Dean, where he studied under Chris Clarkson, and had previously worked in the National Museum of Wales, the Oxford Conservation Consortium, and at Archbishop Marsh's library in Dublin. Andrew has been cataloguing medieval bindings of the English manuscripts at the Bodleian Library, dating from the 12th century, broadly defined. He teaches the materiality of books and manuscripts within the university and to summer schools, and publishes on book conservation, book binding, and paper history. And today he will be revisiting the work of Graham Pollard, a name who seems to come up in many of the lectures over the past year, and will address us under the title New Observations on the Construction of English 12th Century Bindings at the Bodleian Library. Andrew, please.
In November 1961, Graham Pollard gave a paper on this subject to the Oxford Bibliographical Society. So it's gratifying that after only 65 years, and presumably following due consideration, the Senior Society has thought that it is a subject worthy of a repeat in London. This, of course, is a very cheap joke, I'm sorry. His talk was published by the Society as The Construction of English 12th Century Bindings in the March 1962 issue of the Library. It was a groundbreaking and pioneering study which remains a classic and is still required reading on the subject today. Pollard illustrated his paper with these two plates, showing 12 bindings from Oxford collections, 7 from the Bodleian, 3 from Jesus, 1 each from Corpus and Christ Church colleges. They are well-chosen examples in remarkable condition, that is, 12th century bindings with the Romanesque structure, representing approximately 20% of the 60 examples that he thought were in Oxford. His talk and article was the result of 18 months of intense research into largely uncharted territory, but it still represents the foundation of all I will say today. Pollard modestly called his article a preliminary account, describing in his words, and I quote, a distinct and recognisable style of binding, all in 22 dense pages. I fear my examples tonight will be less spectacular. If Pollard provided an overview and way of understanding this distinct and recognisable style of binding from English examples, my talk will focus on what we are beginning to learn from a project to catalogue the medieval bindings of English manuscripts dating from about 1066 to about 1250 at the Bodleian Library in Oxford, hopefully starting to move from the general to the particular. This 13th century manuscript from St Albans has a portrait miniature of 12 of the 12 patriarchs, with 2 of them holding bound codices. At the bottom right, Benjamin gestures with an outstretched finger to a binding which a contemporary reader with features that would have been identified. Sorry, let me start again. He gestures with an outstretched finger to a binding with features that would have identified it as a book to a contemporary reader, and which is recognisable as one of Pollard's English 12th century bindings. The cover extends and projects at the head and tail of the spine to form tabs, and there are 4 bosses on the right board and a long left to right clasp strap. Two further articles by Pollard built on his 1962 paper. In 1975, he published some Anglo-Saxon book bindings in the Book Collector, based both on direct observations and x-rays of wooden boards to analyse the method of board attachment for early bindings. Alongside his Anglo-Saxon focus, he also included 3 manuscripts with a Romanesque structure from the Bodleian. In 1976, he published Describing Medieval Book Bindings in a volume of essays presented to Richard Hunt, the keeper of Western manuscripts at the Bodleian. That equally dense article provided 4-period typology of medieval bindings, with his 12th century bindings as type 2. The order of his diagnostic features started on the outside and worked in. And 2 of these features, tabs and flat spines, can be seen in this miniature. But the others, his construction details, require a direct study of the methods and techniques used to bind books. But before I go further, I'd like to recap on Pollard's diagnostic features that mark out his distinct and recognisable style of binding. That is, bindings with a Romanesque structure. These are most noticeable in the very small number of bindings that have come down to us unchanged, such as this extraordinary manuscript of a glossed Luke, written and bound at St Augustine's Abbey, Canterbury, and now in the collection of Blackie House Library and Museum in Edinburgh. First in Pollard's list is tabs, and we can see the tabs at the ends of the spine, comprising both the covering material and a thick spine lining that was worked with the end-bands. Though it's hard to see it here, it is also faced with a textile. Not on Pollard's list, but seen in the miniature, is the remaining left to right long pin strap, which closed onto a side pin at the centre of the right board. Later vertical shelving in libraries, these bindings do not make good neighbours, mean that very few of these fastenings remain. Second in Pollard's list is flat spines, seen here in a manuscript from Salisbury. though the spine is not entirely flat, you can see. At head and tail, the alum-tooled covering bulges over the spine linings that form the basis of the tab end bands. And we can also see that the cores for the end bands are laced into tunnels in the corner of the boards. The boards have square edge profiles and the edges of the leaves are cut flush with the boards. Pollard's third feature are described as, and I quote again, thongs enter a tunnel in the thickness of the boards, seen here in a manuscript from St Albans. The manuscript is pack sewn all along with undyed plain thread at 4 sewing stations on 2 raised split strap sewing supports of alum-tooled skin, with the sewing supports laced through oblong tunnels in the spine edge of the boards. We can also see sewn end bands work through the spine lining on a single core of alum-tooled skin with plain undyed thread. Pollard's 4th and 5th diagnostic features are, and I quote again, not more than 4 thongs, which extend halfway across the board. Here we can see that the 2 sewing supports are laced through oblong tunnels in the spine edge of the boards into channels in a long lacing path, with wooden wedges securing the sewing supports. Pollard's observations still stand today, and I'm afraid my talk will not alter his general picture of these bindings. And it is the method of attaching the sewing supports to the boards through oblong tunnels in the spine edge of the boards which defines this binding as one with a Romanesque structure. However, there has been further work since Pollard, most noticeably in 3 important articles by Chris Clarkson in 1993 and 1996, which went further into the details of these bindings. He not only sought to observe the structures and techniques used in the surviving 12th century English bindings, but also to, and I quote, contemplate what may have motivated the binders. Here I show a manuscript on the left from Malmesbury with his short lacing path, and the manuscript we've already seen from St Albans with his long lacing path. That is, with the sewing supports continuing on the inner face of the boards before being wedged at a second hole. Clarkson expertly explained many of the details of these bindings, and here I show his diagram showing quires and boards trimmed at an angle at the head and tail in preparation for end bands. However, his 1993 paper again presented an overview of this type of binding, concentrating on what he described as, and I quote again, the high point in the binding of the parchment text block. 1999 saw the publication of J.A. Ziermai's The Archaeology of Medieval Book Bindings, with a dense 32-page chapter on Romanesque bindings, his typological group equating to Pollard's group 2. However, only 7 Bodleian manuscripts are referenced in this chapter, and these are largely reporting the observations of others. And he notes that, and I quote again, the main base is formed by my own studies of 110 Romanesque bindings in continental and English collections, end quote. With his research at the Bodleian limited to, and I quote again, the opportunity to re-examine a number of bindings and the original radiographs studied by Pollard. We'll not get away from Pollard tonight. Elsewhere, he noted that my own, I quote again, my own studies were biased by the fact that the majority originates in Central and Western Europe. England is represented by a minute sample, end quote. So all of these studies have laid out the broad characteristics and details of a type of binding used throughout Western Europe, in England from shortly after the Norman conquest to about 1250. Pollard thought that about 300 to 400 English examples existed, with the majority in three main collections. Hereford Cathedral with about 80, mainly from Hereford. Pembroke College, Cambridge with approximately 70, mainly from Bury St Edmunds. And the Bodleian Library and Oxford College collections with about 60, which he describes as, and I quote again, much more heterogeneous collection drawn from the monastic houses all over England, end quote. To these three can be added the collections of Worcester Cathedral. And Clarkson noted that, and I quote again, in consequence, the number of surviving Romanesque bindings is a totally unrepresentative sample. Now, the manuscript collections of Hereford and Worcester cathedrals and Pembroke College have all been catalogued by Rod Thompson, with binding descriptions of the Hereford and Worcester collections by Michael Gullick. This has opened up three of the main collections, but the Bodleian's heterogeneous collection is still less well known. The desire to rectify this has been the prompt for my cataloguing project, though perhaps I should explain how I got to this point. So I'm a book conservator, now working at the Bodleian Library, but I studied under Chris Clarkson at Westdean from 1995 to 1997, at the time when his three major articles and bindings with Romanesque structures were being published. Although interested in these bindings, and who wouldn't be with Chris as a teacher, I thought that I should find my own subject. Later, in 2015, Chris would work on his final conservation project at the Bodleian, with me helping, the conservation of Volume 2 of the Winchester Bible for Winchester Cathedral, the largest of the large 12th-century lectern Bibles. Ill health sadly overtook Chris, and I continued the binding of Volume 2 that was begun by him, and then conserved and rebound the remaining 2 volumes. This unfinished miniature may represent what the first binding of the Winchester Bible might have been. Note even in sketch outline the profile of the tab embands. But it was really an early encounter with another binding, the Glossed Luke from St Augustine's Abbey, that we've already seen, that really planted the seed with me. In 2010, its owner, Bill Zacks, placed the manuscript on deposit at the Bodleian for Bruce Barker Benfield to study. Due to its exceptional condition, Bruce asked whether I would write a brief description of the binding and to compare it with the binding of MS Bodle 826, another manuscript from St Augustine's, now at the Bodleian. They were similar to the bindings described by Pollard, Clarkson and Zearmay, but they had quirks and particular features that didn't quite fit the general picture. I sent a draft version of my description to Michael Gullick, who drew my attention to the gaps between the embam tie-downs and the kettle stitches, comparing them to similar, though slightly different patterns that he had found in bindings from St Albans. In his words, very little had been published on small or large groups of British bindings. My descriptions with handsome illustrations were finally published by Bill Zacks in 2020. And again, my interest might have stopped but for the Winchester Bible. Book conservation is largely a matter of problem solving, though the range of problems to be solved are unique for each book. Unusually, the 4 volumes of the Winchester Bible allowed for both review and then evolution of treatment across the 4 volumes. One area that developed for me was its spine linings. And for volume 4, I worked the embands through alum-toured linings similar to the tab M-bands of the 12th century. Although I'd read about these, it was executing them that really fired my imagination. I was struck by the structural effect they had for both controlling the opening of the bindings and for complementing the board attachment. The Winchester Bible has been bound 3 times before the recent conservation treatment. And one of the cathedral's questions was about the form of the original binding, and particularly its size. Could we discern how large it had been before its edges were trimmed and gilded in the 1820s? The literature on these bindings describes the spine edge at both head and tail of the quires and boards cut away at an angle to allow the M-bands to sit below the flush boards. And we saw examples in both the Clarkson and Zearmay diagrams of this. I remember looking unsuccessfully for evidence of these canted spine edge corners in the disbound manuscript. And these 2 photos catch my eureka moment. Trust me, this is exciting. And this is about as exciting as it gets tonight. The Bible was originally sewn on 7 sewing stations on 5 supports, and there are clear thread impressions from this first sewing. There are also thread impressions at the head and tail from the M-band tie-downs, which extend to the kettle stitches. In these 2 bifolia, I spotted complete tie-downs, and the trim had truncated these on most other leaves. And that it went to a slit rather than a canted spine edge corner. This had not been described before for 12th century bindings. Fortunately, there are 2 other Winchester bindings at Winchester Cathedral, which have these same slits. The pattern of M-band sewing with gaps between the tie-downs and kettle stitches in the St. Augustine bindings, and the slits rather than canted spine edge corners at head and tail of the Winchester bindings, point to observable differences in details, unimportant in themselves, between these 2 centres. Differences largely unrecorded until now. Graham Pollard, of course, had similar thoughts, and I quote his 1962 article again. When I started these inquiries, I thought it might be possible to group the surviving bindings under the religious houses which had first owned them, identifying the features common to each group, and in this way build up a record of a style peculiar to each house, which would in turn enable us to trace the source of a large number of these bindings without any known provenance. However, he goes on to say, it is, I suspect, as hard, perhaps even harder, to say where a book was bound as to say where it was written. Clarkson was even more pessimistic, writing, and I quote, I am sure there are not enough bindings to give one confidence in suggesting differences between the regions of England, although one may be able to identify certain traits peculiar to different religious orders. However, the experience of the Canterbury and Winchester examples made me think these observable differences, described at a level more detailed than attempted by Pollard, might allow these books to be grouped, if not located. It was the experience of these Canterbury and Winchester examples, and realizing that the Bodleian's heterogeneous collection could shed light on many smaller groups of bindings, that led me to suggest English bindings with a Romanesque structure as a group for cataloguing to Martin Kaufmann. He's here tonight, so you can blame him. He enthusiastically agreed, and I have since begun to make detailed catalogue descriptions, working closely with Matthew Holford. It will be possible to include these in the online catalogue of medieval manuscripts in Oxford libraries. This both allows more space than earlier printed catalogues could, and allows individual manuscripts or groups of descriptions to be updated on an ongoing basis. In my conclusions, I'll show some of the results and the methods we're developing to handle this particular class of data, though this is very much ongoing work. However, the first task is to find the bindings to catalogue, not an easy one. Our older summary catalogue has binding descriptions as item 8, but only if remarkable. And these binding descriptions, which cover the bulk, though not all of our medieval collections, are not indexed. To produce a list of possible bindings, I needed to turn to other sources. These have included the new online Medieval Libraries of Great Britain database, where I've been able to export all of the Bodleian manuscripts noted with either a medieval binding or an original binding, and then limit these by date. And I'm fortunate to share an offer with Sian Witherden, who is currently working on this data set. And it's interesting to see the original index cards, which we have on the left here. This card for the St Albans manuscript that we've already seen is the work of 2 people. The main entry is by Richard Hunt, with 2 later editions by Neil Kerr, including the medieval binding. It underlines that all of my work builds on decades of observations by others. I've also relied on 2 published works that include brief information about bindings at the Bodleian. Otto Pech's and Jonathan Alexander's illuminated manuscripts in the Bodleian Library has brief notes about bindings, which were contributed by Graham Pollard. And Andrew Watson's catalogue of dated and datable manuscripts in Oxford libraries uses Pollard's 4 binding periods for his descriptions. There is also an internal library hand list dated from 1979, compiled by E.J. Baronian and Bruce Barker Benfield for bindings in the MS Bodle collection, again using Pollard's 4 periods. Using these 4 sources has produced a list of about 130 manuscript shelf marks. And with this as a starting point, I've begun cataloguing, working on groups of manuscripts grouped by their Medieval Libraries of Great Britain provenance. Where Pollard, Clarkson and Ziermai all concentrated on intact bindings in good condition for their work to define the broader outlines of this style of binding, my approach has been more archaeological, looking for evidence that survives. This has resulted in looking at manuscripts with more or less intact contemporary bindings, as well as those that retain only limited fragments of their earlier bindings. And here are the 7 bindings from Salisbury Cathedral that I've now catalogued. They're not as immediately Romanesque as Pollard's examples, and I'm going to use them tonight as a case study. And here is the previous available information about their bindings. 6 have binding descriptions in the summary catalogue. None of the manuscripts are illuminated or dated, so they don't appear in Peckham, Alexander or Watson. 5 are listed with medieval bindings in Medieval Libraries of Great Britain, but only 3 are listed as period 2 bindings by Baronian and Barker Benfield. 1, you'll see, has no previous binding description. So my list of previous descriptions has only been the starting point to find bindings. I've needed to supplement it by looking at all the manuscripts from each medieval institute within my date range. My list of 3 definite Salisbury bindings rose to 7 that are now catalogued. Other examples range for Reading Abbey, which went from 6 to 16, or Barking, which went from 1 to 2. There are more out there, or there are fragments of more out there than we think. And it'll be interesting to see what the total number might be, though it's going to be much larger than the 60 that Pollard estimated. So where there is previous information about bindings, it's usually brief and could be hard to interpret. When starting to work on the Bodleian manuscripts from the Augustinian Priory and Abbey at Waltham, Essex, I was pleased to find a discussion of 5 surviving binding in Neil Kerr's 1942 article, More Manuscripts from Essex Monastic Libraries, where he describes them as all are of white skin over flat boards. And here are the 3 12th and 13th century bindings now at the Bodleian from his 5. Kerr's description puzzled me, for although the boards are flat, there are differences between them, and they seem to be no flatter than the other bindings that I was cataloguing. I couldn't understand why Kerr was drawing attention to their flatness in 1942, and I wondered if I was missing something important. It was only when I looked into the descriptions of the 2 bindings at Cambridge and found M.R. James's catalogue entries for them that I realised that Kerr had taken the description white skin over flat boards from him. For James, and later for Kerr, flat boards was a useful shorthand description for a binding with a Romanesque structure, though one that I didn't initially recognise. 2 other terms caught my eye: projections and flap, which presumably describe what Pollard would term tab end-bands. None of these were terms that I was expecting and reflect the hard-won accumulation of knowledge about these bindings over decades, and before there was any agreed method or terminology for describing them. Tags, flaps, tabs, projections, flat boards, they're all shorthand terms that I've found used to describe these bindings, but ones that I didn't previously expect or recognise. When faced with a similar proliferation of terms, Brian Robson took a laissez-faire approach when producing his typology of the swords of the British Army. Bookbinding studies have likewise introduced many terms, particular to different authors. But as Ziermeier realised, the absence of an established and uniform terminology hindered his ability to achieve a precision when describing bindings. This has changed since the launch of the Legatus Language of Bindings Thesaurus, which now provides a reliable terminology linked to definitions. And I have so far used about 250 of the Legatus terms within my catalogue descriptions. But to return to the Salisbury manuscripts of my case study, here are the 7 bindings that I've now catalogued, and for information about the manuscripts, I've been able to draw on Tessa Webber's 1992 Scribes and Scholars at Salisbury Cathedral, circa 1075 to circa 1125. 6 of the 7 were bound at Salisbury in this period, with one a later 12th century manuscript. However, the process of cataloguing has separated the 6 into 3 groups, with surprising differences between them. As we will see, some of this information is buried in layers, each binding becoming an archaeological site. MS Bodle 392 is a collection of sermons copied by a number of Webber's Group 1 scribes. The binding now hides its details. Most obviously, it was altered when it was recovered for Sir Walter Cope in 1602, before he gave it with his collection to the Bodleian. It was later rebacked for the Bodleian in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. However, underneath these later coverings, we can see that the original boards, sewing and sewing supports remain. Although altered, it retains its first binding, one where the 2 supports were laced through tunnels in the spine edge of the boards into channels in a short lacing path and secured with wooden pegs. Both boards are wedge-shaped, with the spine noticeably thicker than the foredge. There is one other noticeable feature. There are exaggerated spine edge corners to the boards, some 11 to 13 millimeters high. This exaggerated canted spine edge corner trim is also found within the text block and is much greater than usually found on bindings with a Romanesque structure, and is much greater than required to accommodate the end bands. It is this unusual feature that allows this binding to be grouped with two others, though two with only parts of their bindings. MS Rule C723 is a 10th century copy of Jerome's commentary on Ezekiel, with later marginal Salisbury notes. It came to the Bodleian with Richard Rawlinson's collections in 1755, when it probably had a loose parchment wrapper. It was altered for the Bodleian in the 19th century when boards were added and all was covered in parchment. However, it retains its early sewing and sewing supports. And the edges of the leaves have not been trimmed. It also has the exaggerated spine edge corner seen in MS Bodle 392. MS Bodle 444 is now a manuscript of two disparate parts, only bound together for the Bodleian after their separate arrivals in the 1620s. Part 1 are 3 works by Isidore, copied at Salisbury by a number of Weber's Group 1 scribes. At the Bodleian, it was added to a much larger manuscript, and although it doesn't retain any of its first bindings, it has not been trimmed. It also has the exaggerated canted spine edge corners seen in MS Bodle 392 and MS Rule C392. Only 2 of the manuscripts were copied at Salisbury, but all 3 were bound there. And this unusual feature confirms that they were all bound in the later 11th or early 12th centuries, grouped by their bindings. This approach of careful observation, recording consistent information for each binding, irrespective of its current condition, is the basis of my cataloguing. MS Bodle 827, an Ambrose copied at Canterbury circa 1100, retains its first binding. With raking light, it's possible to discern the channels of the long lacing path to its boards, even though they're covered by the paste downs and covering. Graham Pollard arranged for the boards of 13 Bodleian manuscripts to be x-rayed at the Research Laboratory for Archaeology and the History of Art in Oxford in November 1974, whilst carrying out the research for his 1975 article, Some Anglo-Saxon Book Bindings. Although his focus was Anglo-Saxon boards and board attachment, he included some later bindings in his list. In his letter to the Bodleian requesting this analysis, he notes that 3 manuscripts are, and I quote, post-conquest, but it is necessary to look for some indications of when the practice of using the grooves on the outside as well as the inside of the boards was discontinued. 3 of the bindings had Romanesque structures. MS Bodle 827 was one of them, and I show the 1974 X-ray. The speed of writing the article led Pollard to confuse some of the details of board attachments, and these were only fully reassessed and explained by Clarkson's article of 1996. His X-rays are remarkable, though, confirming details that can only be inferred from an intact binding, and exposing others that cannot be seen, such as the holes of unknown purpose drilled in the spine edge of both boards in line with the kettle stitches. Some of the other Salisbury bindings led me to approach Dr. Kelly Dominey of the Ashmolean Museum to see if their pulsed digital X-ray would provide the same details as Pollard's 1974 ones. A trial group of 5 manuscripts were x-rayed in February of this year by Kelly at the Ashmolean. Here we can see their portable x-ray generator and the control station in an adjacent area of the cast gallery. Kelly suggested that the trial group should include 2 that had been previously x-rayed so we could compare results. And this is perhaps the most dramatic point in my talk tonight. It was very exciting to see her press the button. Kelly experimented with a different number of pulses until we got satisfactory results. And here is the new result for the previously x-rayed MS Bodle 827. Again showing the long lacing path, and again with the holes of unknown purpose drilled in the spine edge of the boards in line with the kettle stitches. Having proved that it worked, Kelly then x-rayed 3 of the bindings from Salisbury. This technique was also used on my second Salisbury group. MS Bodle 835 is an Ambrose copied in Salisbury in the later 11th or early 12th century by, again, Tessa Webber's Group 1 scribes. Its binding is in remarkable condition, though the left board has been damaged by the removal of a 15th century chain staple. It retains its end bands worked through thick spine linings that form the tab extensions, though these have since been cut off where they projected beyond the end bands. The spine edge corners of both the text block quires and the boards have the more usual modest canted trim, not the exaggerated trim found in my previous Salisbury group. However, the board attachment lacing is unusual and different to that in the other group. MS Bodle 392 had the standard long lacing path we've seen. MS Bodle 835 is different. Each of the 2 sewing supports are laced through oblong tunnels in the spine edge of the boards into channels in a short lacing path. But the support is then separated into 2 with each half secured individually with pegs at staggered holes. This form of attachment hadn't been recorded before. The new X-ray allows us to fully understand the method. The separated sewing supports share a channel on the outer face of the boards, though they are then pegged at staggered holes. It's an unrecorded variant of the short lacing path, though one that only exists in one intact example so far. MS Bodle 765 is an Ambrosiasta copied in Salisbury in the later 11th century by 6, again, of Webber's Group 1 scribes. It now has an inboard binding with a Gothic structure with peripheral cushions to its boards. It was rebound at Salisbury in the 15th century following repairs to 8 of its quires. It was re-sewn on 5 supports, which are laced over the spine edge of the boards, a Gothic structure. But there are traces of another, possibly earlier board lacing, now at the foredge of both boards. This is for 2 sewing supports, with each secured with pegs at staggered holes, as we saw in MS Bodle 835. The positions of the earlier sewing stations within the spine folds of the manuscripts match the positions of these lacings, though these are now mainly hidden by the 15th century covering. This binding was also included in the X-ray trial. The results show it has the same unusual staggered short lacing path as seen in MS Bodle 835. Though the tunnels in the original spine edge of the boards were removed when they were planed for peripheral cushions in the 15th century. For the rebinding, the boards were turned, but reused for the same manuscript. These two manuscripts, one still with its first binding and the second rebound in the 15th century, can be grouped together by their first bindings, distinct from my first Salisbury group of three. However, MS Bodle 516 complicates this picture further. It's a 10th century composite manuscript with the two parts bound together by the 11th century when it was at Salisbury. It has a complex binding history consisting of at least three phases, and in reverse order. It was repaired and rebound in Oxford for the Bodleian before 1922, which we can see here, with a Gothic structure. It was previously rebound at Salisbury in the 15th century with a Gothic structure, and then it was bound at Salisbury in the later 11th or early 12th century with a Romanesque structure. And there is evidence for and remains of each phase. For the most recent Bodleian binding, the manuscript was entirely repaired and resewn, but it retains and reuses the boards and covering from the 15th century binding, which we can see show the mark of the chain staple and rust from its iron chain. It also retains the left end leaves added for the 15th century rebinding, waste end leaves recycled from another Salisbury manuscript with both an ex dono inscription and damage from wood boring insects which predate their use within this binding. Removing the 15th century cover during the Bodleian rebinding unearthed the earlier, later 11th or early 12th century covering with a 3-line longitudinal title inscription on the spine. Impressions to the tawed skin show that this was the cover for an inboard binding with a Romanesque structure, one sewn on 2 supports. The right end leaf from the later 11th century or early 12th century binding was retained for the 15th century rebinding, but removed in the early 20th century and has now been re-referenced at the Bodleian. It is part of a leaf from a copy of Deuteronomy, an 8th or 9th century manuscript from Mercia. It was recycled for the binding, and I've shown it here as it would have appeared as the end leaves. 2 other leaves from this manuscript were also used as end leaves for manuscripts at Salisbury. The end leaves link the binding to Salisbury, carried out at a similar time as our 2 other groups. You can see that this manuscript has a complex binding history, which has resulted in an equally complicated binding description. Looking at the boards with raking light indicates that the earlier boards might also have been retained and reused in the 15th century. 15th century and 20th century lacing channels for 4 supports can be seen, and there are also lacing channels for 2 supports in the long lacing path, with M-band lacing at head and tail. However, the tail foredge corner of the left board puzzled me. There appears to be damage to the board and tears to the 15th century that I couldn't interpret. This binding was the 3rd to be x-rayed by Kelly at the Ashmolean and confirms this binding history. The holes for 4 supports used for the 15th century and 20th century can clearly be seen, as well as tunnels and channels with a long lacing path for 2 sewing supports, which match the position of the impressions of the supports on the earlier cover. We can also see the lacing for M-bands, 2 holes for a chain staple and a strap anchorage. Although rebound twice, evidence for its later 11th or early 12th century binding with a Romanesque structure can be seen. More surprising is the evidence from the foredge. catching a moment during its binding. Tunnels have been prepared for 2 sewing supports, as well as 2 oblong holes for each in a long lacing path, though the surface channels between them have not been cut. The modest canted spine edge corner and tunnels for the emband cores were cut, though the one seen at top left must have broke at this point. It's the damaged corner I mentioned, and you can almost still hear the binder swearing. They stopped further work and turned the boards to reuse it and prepared the other edge. These 6 bindings from Salisbury were all bound at Salisbury within a relatively short period of time. They're all bindings with Romanesque structures, but can be separated into 3 groups by differences in construction detail. And these details are unimportant in themselves, but presumably show at least 3 different binders at work, and show that there can be differences in types of binding within one monastic setting at the same time. Pollard's hope for a style peculiar to each house is further away. Now, William of Malmesbury tells us that St. Osmond, even after he became the 2nd Bishop of Salisbury, that's Old Sarum, from 1078 to his death in 1099, and I quote, did not disdain the writing or even the binding of his books. Might one of these groups be his? Now, for the Salisbury bindings, I've been incredibly lucky to rely on the detailed evidence presented by Tessa Weber on Salisbury scribes. For other bindings, there is less supporting evidence. These are the 3 Bodleian manuscripts whose bindings have Romanesque structures from the Augustinian Abbey at Waltham, Essex. The 3 we saw earlier. The 3 with Neil Care's flat boards. Although all were at Waltham, it's not known where they were copied. 2 of them have later secondary covers or chemises, but there are other similarities between them. MS Rule D1228 is a composite manuscript now of 3 parts. Part 1 dates from the 12th century and has a binding with a Romanesque structure. In the 15th century, all of the manuscripts after part 1 were cut out of the binding, and replacement parts 2 and 3 were attached to the remains of the binding with sewing through the primary cover. At this point, a blank leaf, part of the separate left end leaves, was put down over the earlier paste down, though this has more recently been lifted at the Bodleian. The earlier paste down is unfinished scriptorium waste, contemporary with part 1, identified by Leslie Smith as part of a glossed Luke. Although the manuscript and the binding are now composite, enough remains to describe the first binding, one which has a secondary spine tabs formed from 3 layers of alum-tawed skin, and with the M-band cores laced through round tunnels in the head or tail edges of both boards. Both of these are unusual features. MS Rule A433 is another composite manuscript from the later 12th century. It also has a later secondary cover or chemise from Waltham Abbey. The end leaves are also unfinished scriptorium waste, identified by Peter Todt as part of Gregory I's homily in Evangelia. As used, each of the 2 paste downs is most of the bifolium, where one of the leaves is written on both sides and the other blank. It appears there was an error in layout or planning, and though both of them have spine folds, neither have holes from sewing. They're not recycled from a finished or bound manuscript. The binding is more intact and has the remains of a small rounded projection at the tail. Like MS Rule D1228, the tab is formed from multi-layered secondary spine linings. In this case, 4 layers of parchment, a layer of tanned leather, and a multicolored textile layer. At the head where the tab has been lost, some of these layers can be seen. The embouchure has obligingly broken at the left joint, showing the same lacing through round tunnels in the head edge of boards. Both of these bindings share the same uncommon features, as well as both using recycled contemporary scriptorium waste for their end leaves. They must have been bound in the same workshop, one connected to a scriptorium, but whether this was at Waltham Abbey requires more work. I believe that both the Salisbury and Waltham examples show that it's possible to place these bindings into groups, even if it's not possible to say who bound them, and without scribal evidence where they were bound. Where it is known where and when a manuscript was copied, and if the binding is the first one, then we can presumably assume that the date and location of binding will be more or less the same as the manuscript. MS Auct F314 is a collection of computistical texts copied at Malmesbury for William of Malmesbury before 1125. The manuscript came to the Bodleian in 1602 with Sir Walter Cope's collection, and it was also recovered for him before it arrived. However, under this recovering, the first binding with a Romanesque structure survives. Rod Thompson, in his William of Malmesbury, noted that, and I quote, "It contains an interesting collection of computistical texts put together from several exemplars. 14 scribes worked on it, including William himself. And it is William who wrote this title list on the left separate free end leaf." Thompson states, "I think it is clear that William was not dependent upon an organised scriptorium for the making of this book. He was the initiator and supervisor, evidently deciding what was to go in and supplying the exemplars. It is his collection, but he had to find scribes from among those monks who were willing to help out, even for a leaf or column. I believe that for the binding, he also sought those monks who were willing to help out." During the recovering of 1602, the binding was altered with the sewing supports and embouchures cut away from the inner face of the boards. And there we can see later linen linings now stuck to the board. This method of board attachment is most unusual. The two sewing supports are laced through tunnels in the spine edge of the boards and continue in an idiosyncratic long lacing path. The holes drilled through the thickness of the boards for the support slips are round rather than the usual oblong, and there are no channels or recesses on the inner or outer faces of the boards. The support slips and embouchures have since been cut away on the inner face of the boards, which were covered with a gesso-like substance after covering. Clean areas without this filler can be seen between the lacing holes, indicating the original path of the supports. I just want to draw attention to the bit with the blue arrows. Here the support slip continues beyond the second hole on the outer face, returning to the first hole where it's secured with an oak peg. Most unusual. This type of attachment has not been recorded before. Might it point to a scribe attempting a binding without previous training? The cataloguing of this binding has also revealed other unexpected features. Parts 1 and 2 and the end leaves all have gently rounded canted spine edge corners, while parts 3 and 4 have much larger canted spine edge corners. There are unused sewing stations from an earlier first sewing in parts 3 and 4. This is the first binding of parts 1 and 2, but the second for 3 and 4. An understanding of the binding helps to explain both the production of the collection and the ad hoc scriptorium and bindery at Malmesbury. In 1905, the Bodleian librarian Strickland Gibson, in his pioneering article, The Localization of Books by Their Bindings, stated that, and I quote, "Results likely to be of service can only be obtained by patient investigation of minutiae." I hope I have not strayed too far into the minutiae this evening. I fear I have. Pollard, Clarkson, and Ziermai all provided the foundational tools to investigate these bindings. But I hope that this cataloguing project is starting to add details which will allow these bindings to be considered more fully in the context of their manuscripts and not just as bindings. They are being described using the controlled vocabulary of the language of bindings thesaurus in the order of binding, with each phase of binding, rebinding or alteration described separately. The structure of the descriptions demands a certain rigour, which often helps to make sense of the minutiae when faced by a complex binding. The descriptions for Salisbury will be the first to be added to the online catalogue, and I offer here a preview of what is to come. However, behind the prose descriptions will also sit text encoding initiative markup by phase and feature that will allow these descriptions to be further interrogated in the future. And I'd like to thank Matthew Holford for his work on this. This is an example of his work to represent using TEI, and I quote him again, the difference between bindings where a feature survives and those where it is lost, but its former presence can be inferred. Now I'm going to conclude with two final bindings quickly. The first from St Albans, MS Lord MISC 363, is a collection of theological tracts as a single codicological unit from the first half of the 12th century. It very much fits the description of bindings with the Romanesque structure given by Pollard, Clarkson and Ziermai. This is the first binding of the manuscript, but it has a feature that changed during the planning and then execution of the binding. It has a change of quire structure and number of lines per page between quires 9 and 10. And this is also mirrored in a difference in preparation of the quires for binding. Quires 1 to 9 are cut with a modest canted spine edge corner of the quires, while quires 10 to 19 do not have these canted corners, but have slits at head and tail of the spine folds. This might indicate the preparation was carried out in the scriptorium rather than by the binder. And you'll remember that it's these types of slits in the Winchester Bible that first piqued my interest. This binding may indicate the picture is even more complex. I will end with a manuscript from the Abbey of the Benedictine Nuns at Barking, Essex. MS Lord, Lat 19. Are copies of the Song of Songs and Lamentations, both glossed and from the 12th century. Again, with a standard binding with a Romanesque structure. The spine tabs beyond the end bands have been cut away, but they were lined with a multicoloured woven textile. Like many of the bindings I've shown today, it has features that I've not seen elsewhere. In this case, it's the shape of the channels on the inner face of the boards, which have an extended triangular shape. These small differences are not important in themselves. All of these bindings are essentially the same, and yet they are all different. Pollard's hope of finding a style peculiar to each house may be too simplistic. I don't believe there will be a single diagnostic feature, but rather a range that may exist in certain combinations. But we can't fully appreciate the range of differences until they are better known. To end, I'd like to emphasise that this is very much a work in progress. The structure and method for compiling the catalogue descriptions of bindings with the Romanesque structure at the Bodleian is now in place, and I will continue to work on these. However, until many more have been catalogued, it will not be possible to start to write the wider history of their bindings. And I realise there's many areas that I've not been able to cover tonight. This binding has additional holes drilled from the spine edge to the outer face in line with the kettle stitches, again of unknown purpose. I've now seen these 3 times, though their purpose still eludes me. Perhaps when in Pollard's terms, the heterogeneous collections drawn from the monastic houses all over England at the Bodleian have been catalogued, we may be able to understand them more. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for a really amazing overview of these manuscripts. I think patient examination and minutiae is something that this society has stood for very strongly since its foundation, and you've demonstrated this very well. I have at least half a dozen questions for you, but I know that there are many binding experts in the room and also not very much time. So I think, could I ask those of you watching online to enter any questions in the chat, and if we don't have time to get to them, then I'll pass them on to Andrew afterwards. But maybe we could take 1 or 2 questions from the audience. Yes, I think you were first.
I wonder whether the boards themselves have any information that's not been exploited. They're so clear in the X-rays that I wonder whether dendrochronology could be applied to tell us their age and perhaps even where they were harvested from the forest.
You're not the first person to ask this. Graham Pollard's the X-rays that Graham Pollard had made in 1974, some of those were borrowed by John Fletcher, who was a pioneer of dendrochronology. He managed to get dates out of some of them, but not all. Unfortunately, they're rarely large enough to give you a felling date, and his date ranges didn't greatly add to the information about the bindings. But it's on something else. We've just been looking at dendrochronology, and it's certainly an interesting area to think about, and whether the X-rays are actually clear enough to record
that. Too many questions to ask after a really fascinating proof that the beauty does lie in the detail. But one point, those mysterious holes in the back edge of the boards, I wonder whether they were for wooden pegs to hold the bottom end of the tab bindings, the pieces of skin on them used for the tabs, attaching them to the back edge of the board. So I seem to remember seeing continental examples of that in photographs as well, and they would not have been used again once the tabs had gone.
ZMI reproduces them beautifully, and I use them actually on the Winchester Bible. I took great pleasure in making my own trennels. Chris Clarkson thought for MS Bodle 827 that they were holes for trennels. However, there's no evidence that there's anything in them, and there are no marks in the spine linings for the tab end bands that match them. So I don't think we know yet, but I'm just looking out for more.
And if I could sneak in another quick one. Is there any evidence that the edges were cut in boards after the books were sewn?
Presumably they must have been, which is, I mean, I don't want to go into canted spine edge corners and slits and so on again, but the intriguing thing is that this might be scriptorium preparation, because that's the bit that's harder to cut in boards, but I've not seen enough evidence of that yet.
Oh. Yep. Okay, thank you very much. Much to talk about with more time.
Yes, one question at the back, Laura. Oh, yes.
Andrew, thank you so much. That was fantastic. A quick question. I think it was MS Org 314 you said was unconventional, and maybe the scribe had done that binding himself. Is that easy to do? It looked very technical and complicated, and you had to be trained at the idea of like an ad hoc basis saying, I think I'll whack this in here and I'll do that and I'll do that. Is that something that we have other examples of, perhaps?
Several people have stopped me using the joke, do we know if William of Malmesbury did a bookbinding evening class? There are bits about it that look conventional, but there are bits that are just odd. So that having the lacing that sits on the surface of the boards rather than in channels, and then kind of not knowing what to do at the end. So, okay, we'll go through again. And it's, you know, until we see more, I don't know. I mean, the Sauls, no, that's Malmesbury, isn't it? We don't know. And until we gather more information, I don't think we will know if there are more sort of, it's got a kind of ad hoc look to it. It doesn't help that it's been recovered for Walter Cope because it looks very Frankenstein now, but we don't know yet.
Yes, Miriam.
Thank you, Andrew. A question about the tabs. Sometimes I thought the tabs were an extension of the spine lining, but sometimes, and more often, I think, they were sort of sewn on to the spine lining. Can you extinguish when they were sewn on to the spine lining?
Not yet, but it's more, there seems to be more variation in them than Clarkson or ZMI lead us to believe. So there, and which is, I'm sorry, Nicholas, I'm going to come to you at some point and say, we're not ready yet, but the definition of tab end-band is going to need changing because some of them are primary spine linings where the end-band tie-down is worked through it. Some, there doesn't seem to be any lining, and some, there's a secondary lining over that. But I don't know how many different varieties there are. Some of them are one thick layer, some we saw the Waltham Abbey ones have got multi-layered things. So there's some odd things going on, but we don't quite know yet.
Thank you. I know there are many more questions, but I'm also aware that the Randeria family, some of whom are here in the audience tonight, when they endowed this lecture some years ago, furnished us with drinks and refreshments afterwards. I'm sorry for those of you online that this isn't available directly, but I think that for that reason, we should continue our conversation outside over a glass of wine, but not before we've once again thanked Andrew Honey for a really wonderful talk.